Uncle's Cat. I've been sub to Rocky Eastwood Outdoors for a long time, about a year or so, and he does historical trail walks, talks about a lot of things in a very calm and beautiful way. He's got a really good camera eye, and he's definitely worth subbing. Very much outdoors, very much rational, more on the outdoorsy spectrum than the prepper spectrum, though he occasionally touches on stuff like that. Anyway, he was Navy, or just retired from the Navy, I'm not sure which, and he lived in Maryland, and check out his old videos, they're great if you're ever going to go hiking anywhere near the Maryland area. But he's moved back to Japan, and he's now doing trails in Japan, and great trails, and it's a different culture, and it's beautiful, just fascinating walks he goes on, and definitely worth subbing. Anyhow, he made a comment, and he gave me a link to TEPCO, which is the Tokyo Electrical Power Company, including Fukushima Daiichi, which you may or may not have heard of. So on March the 11th, 2011, 11/3/11 I guess, but that never got into the public consciousness, there was a large earthquake off the coast of Japan, which is not entirely unexpected, and the resulting earthquake caused damage to several nuclear power stations, but one in particular. And then the tsunami wave that was generated caused massive devastation to a large area of Japan. And one of the power stations, nuclear power stations, actually more than one power plant, was inundated with water and lost containment and even exploded. So as you can see from these slides, it's not exactly something you can really do. They could have had a larger containment wall. They're now building a larger containment wall. They didn't expect the tsunami to hit the way it did. But as you can see, the devastation was total, and now they're spending billions to trillions fixing it. But the sight of a nuclear power station on fire is kind of dramatic, and it grabbed the world's attention, and to some parts of the world it still is. This is just a bit of a timeline about what actual damage there was. As you can see, large parts of the power station suffered catastrophic failure, and that certainly grabbed people's attention. So when we saw stuff like this, it was really dramatic, and it was scary, and still is to some degree. But the reality was a lot more scary. It made people question nuclear power, and it's I'm not going to get into that too much. But where do we go from here? What do we do about this? I mean, radiation, like pandemic, is one of the two things you can't really prep for. You can to some degree, but you're still going to require a lot of luck. At least with a radiation event, for most of them, you'll be able to actually flee out of the area and limit your exposure, which you can't do for a pandemic. So it's one of the two big fears, I think, for preppers is pandemic or radiation from whatever cause. And I think it certainly bears looking at this site. The TEPCO site is interesting. Now, before I get into that, I just want to put a couple of slides up showing how humanity is very short-sighted and stupid. As you can see from these maps, we're only looking at land contamination. For some bizarre reason, the ocean is deemed to be non-reactive and non-affected by radiation leaks, whereas the truth of Fukushima is vast amounts of radiation were actually distributed, not so much in the air, though that was significant as you can see, but into the ocean. Now, there are various sites online that monitor Fukushima and to various degrees of rationality. A couple of those sites are fairly famous, and I'll probably get somebody to recommend one down below. I would bear in mind and point out to people that a lot of people online doing specialty issues like this actually are raising funds for various things like boats to do science when they're not a scientist. And in fact, they never buy a boat, they just rent somebody's boat or borrow somebody's boat. So this can be cash transfer from you to them based on your fear and your concern. So be skeptical when people want cash off you online. Be very careful what you do with the cash. That's just an aside. So the TEPCO site is fascinating. You've got 10 routes that you can take, and you look around it, and when you select the English, you get this really calm lady talking to you to reassure you and show you everything's fine. And this is an example of that. They talk about most of the cherry trees had to be chopped down, but the ones that left make for a nice work environment as you walk around Fukushima cleaning up radiation. So there are 10 routes to select, and it is mostly point of view from the camera from the front of a car. They do very little panning, which is interesting. But there are pop-ups, and you can ask questions online. They've very carefully constructed this site, and it's fairly new. I think it's 2018. As you can see, it's all about we're doing this, we're cleaning this up, everything's clean and decent, we have a plan, it's working, it's going to be fine. Which you may or may not want to agree with, but to actually look around the inside of this, I think actually is useful, especially for people that are in terror that everybody's going to die in California. But the truth of it is, there is a vast amount of radioactive waste that's going to be radioactive for hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands of years, generated by this one accident. And to look around the site is a blessing, I think, to actually see it, even though it is propaganda, because everything is. I think it's really great to be able to see what they're actually doing. These bags are just full of chopped down trees, probably those poor cherry trees. So thank you, Rocky. You thought I'd be interested in it. I was fascinated, totally fascinating. And I do recommend anybody interested in nuclear radiation power plant disasters, or Fukushima in specifics, to actually go to the site and poke around and look at it. It is really interesting. But bear in mind, it is propaganda from TEPCO to put them in a better light than they have previously been in, having been partially responsible for one of the world's worst nuclear catastrophes, and very, very close to a massive urban population centre called Tokyo. So when you look at 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, Sellafield, there's a whole bunch of them. There is a reaction to actually we should have no nuclear power, and it's crazy. And Kitty definitely falls on that line. I'm a little bit not so much on that line, but I do think that we should treat nuclear power as extremely toxic and dangerous, and to use economics by putting it on the oceans and on the lakes rather than pump water up to higher elevations because it costs too much. I think we should be looking at how we're interacting with the world and take a more long-term perspective about nuclear power and things like that. Anyways, you see from these slides, nuclear power doesn't kill as many people as other forms of energy, and that's true, but it is definitely an emotional reaction when you see this. Global deaths from natural catastrophes, just put this up as a comparison. We're getting more and more able to avoid killing large numbers of people as technology progresses. So one of the things in SHTF is you will actually have more people die from natural disasters. Now, is world population related to Fukushima? I could claim it is, but then I could also put up a slide that shows that over time fertility rates have dropped with increasing nuclear power, but I could also put up another slide that shows that the work week has dropped as well. So it's difficult to know. What I would say to do is to make sure that you try not to live downwind or close to nuclear power stations. Inherently it's not a good idea. I did have a cousin, invasive thyroid cancer, about 8 years after the Sellafield release in the 1950s when she was a small child. Was that related to Sellafield? It was. She lived and she did fine, but it's not something you want to play around with. And radiation is something that's going to adversely affect children and young adults way more than old people like me. So make sure if you are near to a nuclear power station or a military base that has nuclear engines in it, or a university that has a power station in it, because a lot of them do, make sure you do have iodine tablets and stuff like that, and you know how to use them, specifically if you have children. Anyway, thanks Rocky, all the best everybody, and have a great week. Toodles. And remember, in SHTF, tomorrow will always be worse than today, unless you prepare.